The pointed end of the broken iron chair leg was lodged in her palm, as if it were part of her own bone and flesh. Brielle's knuckles were white, the only color left in hands that had long since gone numb. A dark red line of blood crept slowly from her temple down across her cheek, where she had been shoved into the sharp edge of an iron table only minutes earlier, the blood staining her pale skin, and the black server's uniform already covered in street dust. That was the only wound anyone could see. The others, the wounds carved deep into her soul across 27 brutal years of living, were invisible, but they were the source of the fire burning now in those gray-blue eyes. Not the fire of courage, the fire of someone who could no longer bear to stand by and watch one more time. 3 large men in black masks had her surrounded on a narrow street on Chicago's south side. One held a gun, the other 2 were groaning, one clutching a broken wrist, the other favoring a leg after a stab wound had gone through his thigh. But the leader was still standing, the barrel of his gun aimed straight at Brielle's chest, his eyes above the mask boiling with the fury of a man humiliated by prey that should never have dared to fight back. Behind her, an elderly woman with white silver hair held a 5-year-old girl tightly against her. The old woman's wrinkled hands clutched the back of Brielle's shirt, as if holding onto a life raft in a violent sea. The child sobbed against her grandmother's chest, her tiny hand still gripping a crushed yellow wildflower, the flower she had picked for her grandmother only minutes earlier, when the world had still been peaceful, when butterflies had still drifted through the air, when laughter had still lived on the sidewalk. Mrs. Dorothy whispered words of comfort in a trembling voice, a sound as fragile as birdsong inside the silence of violence that had swallowed the empty street. The people passing by had fled long ago. A fruit vendor still stood frozen at the corner, mouth open but unable to make a sound. No one called the police. No one ran in to help. There was only her, a waitress from a cheap diner, her uniform streaked with dust, her sneakers worn thin at the heels, her hand wrapped around a jagged iron rod torn from an outdoor café table and chair set. The leader ground his teeth behind the black cloth, his voice rough with rage. "Move aside. This is the last time I'm telling you. Move. Aside." Brielle said nothing. Her breath rasped in her dry throat. She shifted her weight, the worn soles of her shoes scraping against the hot asphalt. The iron rod in her hand was her only shield, her only weapon, a scrap of metal that had somehow become the scepter of defiance. She didn't answer. Her answer lived in the pain of her clenched jaw, in shoulders that refused to bow, in gray-blue eyes fixed on the barrel of the gun without blinking. She would not move. She would not let go. She would break before she bent. The bullet that had grazed her temple only minutes earlier had not made her retreat. That sharp burst of pain had burned away the last haze of fear and left behind a pure, terrible focus. And the man with the gun could see it in her eyes. The absolute certainty of someone willing to die right here, right now. Not because she was brave, but because 11 years earlier, she had stood frozen while her little sister was beaten down in front of her, and she had run. She had lived with that wound every day, every night, inside every nightmare, inside every bowl of porridge eaten alone at 4 a.m. And today, on this blistering summer street, when the crying of that 5-year-old child sounded exactly like Penny's cries back then, the dam inside Brielle finally burst, and what poured out from the wreckage wasn't fear. It was fire. They didn't know it yet. The 3 men standing on that south side sidewalk in the heat of a June afternoon. They looked at Brielle and saw a thin waitress holding a rusted metal rod. They didn't see the girl who had once learned how to take a beating in a dark apartment where mercy was a luxury. They didn't see the survivor who had sworn to herself in blood and tears that never again would she let a child be hurt in front of her while she didn't think. But more important than that, they didn't know that this impossible moment, a diner waitress standing between gunfire and an old woman holding her grandchild, was the stone cast into the still black surface of a lake. The ripples from it would travel all the way to the center of the most powerful underground empire in Chicago. It would pull her into the world of a man whose name the city spoke only in whispers. It would bring her a home forged in fire, and a family bound together by honor. It would give her a name that even the most dangerous men in the city would speak with respect. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the birth, violent, bloody, and beautiful, of the woman Brielle Dawson had always been born to become. If this story touched you, press like to support stories like this being told again and again. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that one person can still change everything, And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories still to come, because Brielle's journey has only just begun. 14 hours earlier, the world had been nothing but a mute shade of gray. Brielle Dawson's studio sat on the 4th floor of an aging apartment building on Chicago's South Side, where the stairwell smelled of urine and the hallway walls shed, peeling paint in strips like a snake sloughing off its skin. The 4 walls held the odors of mildew and loneliness captive. The kitchen faucet dripped with steady patience through the night, an artificial heartbeat for a room with no life in it. She woke at 4 o'clock in the morning as she did every day, but not because of an alarm, because of the scream. In the dream, her stepfather was there again, a dark shape filling the doorway, the smell of cheap beer rising from his heavy breath. Penny was curled into the corner, eyes wide, mouth calling her sister's name, but no sound came out. Brielle stood between them, her feet stuck to the floor as if cement had been poured over them, one hand raised but unable to reach. Then the impact, then the fall, then silence. Always silence. She jerked upright, cold sweat running down her spine, breath coming fast in the dark. Her hand searched for the light switch, and the weak yellow glow from the overhead bulb spilled across 4 bare walls, bare except for one thing. On the wall opposite the bed, held up by a strip of tape gone yellow with age, was the only photograph she owned. Brielle at 15 and Penny at 10, the 2 sisters sitting on the back steps, afternoon sunlight resting on their hair, both of them laughing. Penny's smile was so wide it showed the gap where her front tooth was missing. It had been the last summer before everything fell apart. Brielle looked at that photograph every morning, not to remember a happy moment, to remember that she had lost it. She got up, washed her face with cold water from the dripping faucet, put on her black server's uniform, faded at the cuffs and elbows, and tied her dark brown hair neatly at the nape of her neck. The mini refrigerator held only half a carton of milk and 2 slices of bread. She ate 1 slice, drank a glass of water, and stepped out of the apartment before dawn had reached the horizon. The South Side, at nearly 5 in the morning, was a gray world that belonged neither to day nor to night. Trash lay still on the sidewalk. Streetlights flickered like the eyes of someone who had not slept. Brielle walked with her head down, shoulders drawn in, her body made smaller as if she were trying to turn herself invisible. Rosie's Diner sat on the corner of Halsted, its pink neon sign flickering with the letter "R dead since last winter," its vinyl booths torn and patched with tape. The smell of hot grease and burned coffee worked deep into the walls. She was the first one there every morning, and the last one to leave every night. Her coworkers thought she was cold. The truth was that she simply had no energy left to pretend she was normal. Her shift moved through the same endless rhythm, carrying plates, wiping tables, pouring coffee, collecting meager tips from faces she never remembered. Near midday, a drunk from the bar next door staggered into the diner, slid into a booth, called her over, then grabbed her wrist when she set down his water. He pulled her toward him, saying something filthy that she didn't bother to hear. Brielle didn't yank her hand away. She didn't scream. She didn't call for the manager. She only looked straight into his eyes. And in those stormy eyes there was nothing. No fear, no anger, no disgust. Only a depthless emptiness so profound that the man looked into it as if he were staring down the mouth of a dry well. He let go, turned away, said nothing more. A coworker watched her anxiously from behind the kitchen counter. Brielle didn't explain. She wiped her wrist with a damp towel and went on carrying a tray of food to the next table. At the end of her shift, when the diner was quiet and the afternoon light slanted through the dirty glass windows, Brielle sat in the corner of the kitchen with her back against the wall and dialed the number she knew better than her own name. Greenfield Nursing Home, Nurse's Station. The familiar nurse on the other end answered gently, but her voice carried the thing Brielle feared most, pity. Penny didn't recognize anyone today, Miss Dawson. She sat looking out the window all day. We tried playing music for her, but she didn't respond. Brielle listened. Her jaw tightened. Her lips pressed together until the taste of iron spread across her tongue. She said, "Thank you," in a voice so calm it was almost unnatural, then hung up. Then she drew her knees up, buried her face in her arms, and allowed herself to hurt. 60 seconds, she counted in her head. 60 seconds was the limit she allowed herself. Her shoulders shook, her breath caught. But there were no tears. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. When the 60th second was over, Brielle Dawson stood up, smoothed her uniform flat, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and stepped outside to keep clearing tables. This wasn't living. It was an endless act of survival, an unbroken cycle of atonement for a failure she would never forgive in herself. Beyond the windows of Rosie's diner, the world roared with sirens and engines. But inside Brielle, there was only the stillness of someone who had grown used to living at the bottom, a fragile piece she had fought to build from ashes, and she guarded it with a wall of silence so thick that no one could break through. She didn't know that foundation was about to be shattered by the scream of a 5-year-old child on a sunlit street, and by a duty her heart could not refuse. More than 20 miles to the north, where the Chicago skyline drove its glass towers into the belly of the sky, the world wasn't gray. It was a panorama of steel and glass, sharp-edged, sterile, cold, clear to the bone. Jude Kincaid's penthouse occupied the top floor of a tower that most people in Chicago didn't know belonged to anyone, and those who did know didn't dare speak of it. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back, motionless as a statue carved from darkness. Dawn was crawling over Lake Michigan, turning the water the color of burnished copper, but the light didn't reach his eyes. Jude Kincaid's eyes were fixed on something else. On the eastern wall of his study, between security monitors and financial charts, hung a single oil painting, a portrait of a woman with auburn hair, green eyes, and a smile both gentle and mischievous, as if she were keeping a secret the whole world longed to know. Catherine Concincaid. 3 years. 3 years since the phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning. Vaughn's voice on the other end, so unnaturally calm, as he reported that Catherine's car had gone through the guardrail on Lakeshore Drive. The brakes had failed. The car had caught fire before emergency crews arrived. Accident, the police concluded. Jude had never believed it. He looked at the painting every morning as a ritual, not to grieve, to remember. Someone had taken Catherine from him, and he had not yet found the answer. That ritual was broken by the one sound in the world that had the right to break it. The patter of tiny bare feet running across the oak floor, quick and uneven like the heartbeat of an excited child. Then the study door flew open, and a storm of dark curls rushed in. Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. Maeve Kincaid, 5 years old, her hair tangled from sleep, her large, bright eyes shining, her small arms wrapped tightly around the teddy bear with one worn ear that she called Mr. Whiskers. She hurled herself straight into Jude's legs with all the force of her 37-pound body and clung to him as if afraid he might disappear. And what happened next was something no one in Jude Kincaid's empire had ever seen, because if they had seen it, they would not have believed their own eyes. The statue melted, his steel-gray eyes softened, the jaw that was always locked tight like iron loosened. Jude lowered himself onto one knee, lifted Maeve with both hands, settled her on one arm, and listened. Truly listened, as though her words were the most important report he had ever received in his life. Daddy, I dreamed about butterflies, really big butterflies, bigger than a table, and it was purple, and it let me ride on its back and fly through the clouds. Maeve talked with both hands flying through the air, her eyes sparkling, her high little voice bright with excitement. Jude nodded solemnly. A purple butterfly, flying through the clouds. Were you scared? No. It was fun. Daddy, did Mommy like butterflies? The question came without warning and landed with perfect accuracy in the one place that had no armor. Jude went still. His eyes flicked to Catherine's portrait on the wall for a fraction of a second, so quickly an adult would not have noticed, but long enough for the crack inside him to widen just a little more. Then he looked back at his daughter, his voice gentler than any order he had ever given. Mommy liked roses, but if a butterfly landed on a rose, she would have liked them both. Maeve beamed as if it were the most perfect answer in the universe. She wrapped her arms around Jude's neck, and he closed his eyes. Just for a second. 1 second in which he allowed himself not to be the king of anything. Only the father of a 5-year-old girl who loved purple butterflies. Take Maeve down to the kitchen before the pancakes get cold. The voice came from the doorway, warm but carrying the kind of gentle authority that even Jude Kincaid obeyed. Dorothy Kincaid stood there, 72 years old, silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, her back still straight, her eyes still bright. She wore a pale gray sweater and a white apron streaked with flour, and she looked like any grandmother in any ordinary home anywhere in the world. But she wasn't ordinary. She was the only person on this earth who could look at Jude Kincaid with stern disapproval and not pay a price for it. Jude carried Maeve down to the kitchen. The kitchen was large, spotless, warm, and filled with the scent of hot butter and maple syrup. 3 pancakes were stacked on Maeve's rabbit-shaped plate, golden on top, crisp at the edges. Dorothy had been awake since 5 o'clock to make them. She was always like that. Breakfast was her sacred ritual, the way she kept this house from becoming a completely cold fortress. Maeve climbed into her chair and bent over her pancakes. Jude sat down across from her, lifting the cup of coffee Dorothy had already poured for him. Dorothy looked at her son, her eyes moving over the shadows beneath his eyes, over the black suit he had been wearing since the night before, without changing, over the 4th cup of coffee he was drinking before 7 in the morning. "You're not sleeping enough, Jude. I saw your light on at 3. There was work to handle, Mother. There's always work to handle." She placed her hand over his. A wrinkled hand, warm, trembling faintly with age, but steady in its grip. She looked straight into her son's eyes with the gaze only a mother can have. A gaze made of love and fear because she knew she was slowly losing the child she had once brought into the world. "Catherine would want you to live, Jude, not just survive." Catherine's name carried a different weight in his mother's mouth than it did when it rose in his mind while he stood before the painting. It was softer. And because it was softer, it hurt more. Jude gently withdrew his hand from beneath his mother's. Not roughly. It was simply a boundary he allowed no one to cross, not even her. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward Maeve, who was smearing maple syrup on the tip of her own nose and giggling, and something in his eyes softened again. This was the only moment in the day when Jude Concincaid was an ordinary human being. A father sitting at breakfast with his aging mother and his little daughter, in a kitchen fragrant with butter, listening to the sound of a child laughing. Beyond the kitchen door, the Empire was waiting. The numbers on the screens, the cold phone calls, the decisions swallowed by darkness. But for these 30 minutes, he was only Jude. The 30 minutes ended when Jude set his coffee cup down on the kitchen table, kissed the top of Maeve's head, gave Dorothy a nod, and walked out through the kitchen door. And in the very instant that door closed behind him, the father disappeared. His stride changed, longer now, heavier, carrying the rhythm of a man accustomed to giving orders. His shoulders straightened into hard lines. His jaw locked. His eyes froze into steel. The mask returned, flawless and unbroken, as if the man who had just smiled because his daughter had smeared syrup on her nose had never existed at all. Jude's study lay at the end of the eastern hallway of the penthouse, sealed off from the rest of the home by a steel door whose code was known to only 2 people, Jude and Vaughn. Inside was another world, a black polished desk without a single speck of dust. 4 screens mounted on the wall displaying financial data, shipping maps, and security camera feeds from 6 different locations across Chicago. No family photographs, no plants, only Catherine's portrait on the opposite wall, but from his chair the painting sat outside his line of sight. That was intentional. In this room, he had no right to be soft. Vaughn was already waiting. Jude's second in command stood by the window, back straight, hands clasped before him, his face expressionless as the surface of a frozen lake. Vaughn never sat before Jude sat, never spoke before Jude allowed it. 12 years of service had turned his loyalty into instinct. Jude took his seat and activated the central screen with a touch. "Report." Vaughn stepped forward, his voice low and even. "Reno Volkov. He's accelerating. His men have been asking about the shipping schedule at the Southport, checking patrol frequency at the Jackson Park warehouse, and tracking the routes of at least 3 primary cargo vehicles. He's not hiding it anymore, sir. He wants you to know he's watching." Jude didn't react. His eyes moved across the data on the screen, his fingers tapping lightly against the desktop to a rhythm only he could hear. "Reno Volkov." He repeated the name as if tasting it on his tongue, then spitting it out. "Tell me something I don't already know." Vaughn paused for a beat. "He's recruiting more men, not locals. Mercenaries out of Detroit and Milwaukee. At least 20 new gunmen in the past month. He's preparing for something bigger than probing the perimeter. Bigger by how much? Not clear yet. But our source says he's been asking about your personal assets, not just business assets." Jude's fingers stopped tapping. Personal assets. The phrase hung in the air for a second, before Jude brushed it aside with a movement at the corner of his mouth so slight it was nearly invisible. Reno Volkov. He knew the man. Knew him too well. 15 years earlier, Reno had been the right hand of Declan Concincaid, Jude's father, the man who had built this empire from nothing but his own 2 hands and a gun. Reno had been there from the beginning, loyal as a dog, violent as a wolf. He had called Declan brother. He had carried Jude when Jude was still a child running around the warehouses. Then Declan died of a heart attack 10 years ago, and Jude took control at the age of 26. The first thing he did was audit the entire operation. The second was discover that Reno had embezzled nearly $2 million in the final 5 years of Declan's life. The third was to summon Reno into this room, lay the evidence on the desk, and say 4 words. Get out of here. No beating, no killing, just exile. That was the only mercy Jude had granted in honor of his father's memory, and Reno had taken it as the worst humiliation of his life. He knows how my father operated, Jude said, his voice calm. He knows the old weak points, the old procedures, the old people, but he's making the most basic mistake of all. Sir, he thinks I'm my father. I'm not my father. Jude turned in his chair and looked directly at Vaughn. Double security on all shipments. Change the shipping schedules at random. No pattern, no repetition. Freeze every new transaction until I say otherwise. If Reno wants to choke, let him swallow his own ambition. Vaughn nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there for another beat, weighing something, then said what 12 years of experience told him he needed to say. Sir, he's asking about personal assets. You may want to consider increased protection for Mrs. Dorothy and Miss Maeve. Jude looked at Vaughn. It was a cold look, not anger, but the absolute certainty of a man convinced he had already calculated every possible move on the board. No one is that crazy. 4 words. Brief. Finale. And the most fatal mistake Jude Concincaid would ever make in his life. Vaughn said nothing. He didn't agree. But he didn't argue either. 12 years had taught him to know when Jude Concincaid didn't want to hear another word. He gave a nod, turned, and walked out of the room. The steel door closed behind him without a sound, and in the dark room lit by 4 glowing screens, Jude Concincaid sat alone, completely certain that he had everything under control. He didn't know that on the other side of the city, inside a damp warehouse reeking of diesel fuel, a madman was laughing, and that man's target wasn't a shipment or a port. It was the old woman who made pancakes, and the little girl who loved purple butterflies. The warehouse stood at the edge of the industrial district on the west side of Chicago, where abandoned railroad tracks cut across vacant lots overgrown with weeds and strewn with broken bottles. The corrugated metal walls were rusted through, the roof leaked, and the air hung thick with the smell of diesel fuel and wet metal. This was Reno Volkov's kingdom, and it said everything about the distance between him and the man he wanted to bring down. Jude Concincaid sat in a penthouse of glass. Reno Volkov sat in a warehouse of tin. That distance was the fuel for everything he did. Reno sat on a cracked old leather chair placed in the middle of the warehouse like a throne in a ruined palace. An expensive bottle of beluga vodka in his right hand, the only luxury he allowed himself to keep from his glory days. He was a man of 45 built out of beef and hatred, with the neck of a bull and a face gone dark red from liquor and rages that never truly died. His gray suit shimmered with the cheapness of the fabric, stretched tight across his massive body, his tie hanging loose, the third button of his shirt pulled so hard it looked ready to burst free. He looked like a blurred photocopy of power, while the original stood 20 miles away in a perfectly tailored suit. Around him, 7 of his men stood in a half circle. Black clothes, hard faces, hands folded across their chests, or shoved into coat pockets, where the outlines of pistols pressed through the fabric. These were not loyal soldiers. They were hired muscle, following him for money and for a license to be violent. But Reno didn't need loyalty. He needed obedience, and the bottle of vodka and the stack of cash on the wooden crate beside his chair had bought him exactly that. On the rusted iron table in front of him lay 2 things. One was a map of the neighborhood near Jackson Park, where Dorothy Concincaid took her granddaughter walking every afternoon. The routes marked in red, the guards' positions circled, the gaps highlighted in yellow, where the old woman usually insisted the bodyguards keep their distance. The other was an old photograph, its 4 corners curled, its colors yellowed with age. In the picture, 2 men stood side by side in front of the prow of a fishing boat at the South Harbor. The man on the left was Reno, 20 years younger, 40 pounds lighter, his smile wide and real. The man on the right was Declan Concincaid, Jude's father. Black hair already touched with gray, eyes sharp but warm, his hand resting on Reno's shoulder the way a man rests his hand on a brother. Reno looked at the photograph for a long time before he spoke, and when he did speak, his voice wasn't the growl his men were used to hearing. It was quieter, rougher, like the voice of a man touching an old burn. 15 years. 15 years I stood beside Declan Concincaid. I was there when he lost his first shipment. I was there when he got shot the first time. I was there when his son was born. He lifted the vodka bottle but didn't drink. He only watched the light coming through the broken roof shine through the clear liquor. Then Declan died, and his 26-year-old boy sat in his father's chair, called me into his office, laid a few papers on the desk, and said, "Get out of here." No thanks. No explanation, like throwing a dog out of the house. He took a long drink. Vodka ran down his chin. He didn't wipe it away. The boy thinks he's a god, sitting up in the sky looking down. He protects the shipments, the ports, the vaults, all the cold things, because he is a cold man. Reno set the bottle down, and when he raised his head, his eyes had changed. The pain was gone. Only calculation remained. But every cold man has one hot thing, the one thing that can burn him alive from the inside. He slapped the map with one hand, the old woman, and the little girl. A murmur moved through the men around him. His thin second in command, eyes troubled, stepped forward one pace. "Boss, kidnapping Concincaid's mother and daughter. He'll burn the whole city down." That's exactly the idea. Reno stood, and the leather chair groaned beneath his weight. He braced both hands on the table and leaned over the map. Jude will go mad. He'll send out all his men to search. He'll burn every relationship he has to get information. And while he is burning, I'll walk through the ashes and take the port, take the warehouse, take everything. By the time he finds his mother and daughter, there'll be nothing left for him to come back to. But if he what? Reno turned, his eyes pinning his deputy in place. He's Declan's son. He'll react exactly the way Declan did, with emotion, with blood. And when a man reacts with emotion, he goes blind. He paused, and what he said next brought the entire warehouse into complete silence, as if someone had suddenly pulled all the air from the room. "Do you know how his wife died?" His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Catherine Concincaid. The car on Lakeshore Drive. The brakes failed. Accident, the police said." He lifted the vodka bottle and turned it slowly in his hand. "Strange, isn't it? The brakes fail on that exact day. The exact day Catherine was planning to speak to the FBI about her husband's operation. That exact day." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The smile on his face told the rest. No one in the warehouse dared breathe too loudly. The deputy swallowed hard and stepped back half a pace. Reno swept his gaze around the room, reading the fear on every face, and he was pleased by what he saw. This afternoon, 3 o'clock, the old woman takes the child walking near Jackson Park. She always makes the bodyguard stand back. One stretch of road, one turn, 30 seconds. We move in, we take them, we leave. Clean, fast. No one has time to see a thing. He set the vodka bottle down on the table beside the old photograph. The two objects lay side by side, past and future, pain and revenge. Who is going to stop us? The question hung in the damp warehouse air, settling against the rusted metal walls and the cracked concrete floor. Reno asked it, and answered it himself with a laugh. His men nodded in silence. And not one person in that room, not even Reno Volkov with 15 years of street experience and a hatred as deep as the ocean, could have imagined that the answer to that question was sitting on a cheap plastic chair outside a roadside café, wearing a faded black server's uniform, carrying a $2 cup of coffee, thinking of nothing except whether there would be enough money at the end of the month to pay her sister's medical bills. June sunlight poured across the south side sidewalk like hot honey, turning the asphalt into a wavering mirror of mirage and heat. Brielle stepped out of Rosie's diner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 hours earlier than usual. A coworker had switched shifts because of a family matter. The manager had nodded and let her go, and Brielle stood on the sidewalk looking at the afternoon spread out before her without knowing what to do with it. Free time wasn't a gift to her. It was empty space, and empty space was always dangerous, because in empty space, memory had room to crawl out. She walked without direction, turned 2 corners, and stopped in front of a small café she had never gone into before. The place had no name, only a handwritten chalkboard propped outside the door that read, $2 coffee. Sit as long as you like. Outside were 4 sets of iron patio tables and chairs, the white paint chipped away to reveal rust-orange metal beneath, but the afternoon light filtering through the branches of an old maple tree along the street cast dancing flecks of brightness across the tabletops, and something in that image made Brielle sit down. She bought a cup of black coffee, held it in both hands even though the day was hot, and sat watching the world pass by. This was something she almost never did. Sit still, observe, allow herself to exist in a place without serving anyone. This neighborhood was quieter than the area around Rosie's. The houses were old but clean, windows lined with flowers, sidewalks meant for walking. An elderly couple passed with a dog. 2 children rode by on scooters. Laughter drifted from somewhere out of sight. Brielle took a long breath and felt her shoulders lower half an inch, such a slight release that she almost didn't notice it. Then she saw them. From the east end of the street, an elderly woman with white silver hair pinned neatly up was walking along the sidewalk with a little girl who had black curls. The woman wore a light cream jacket, her back straight, her pace unhurried but dignified, like someone accustomed to being respected wherever she went. The little girl skipped beside her, one hand holding the woman's hand, the other pointing at the sky, across the street, into the flower beds, at everything at once, her mouth moving without pause. Behind them, about 30 steps back, 2 men in dark suits walked parallel on opposite sides of the street, discreet but alert. Bodyguards. Brielle recognized them immediately. On the south side, you learn to read the body language of men carrying guns before you learn to read words. The old woman stopped at the corner and said something to the 2 men. They hesitated. She said something more, her voice gentle but firm, the kind of voice that didn't accept argument. The bodyguards nodded with reluctance and stayed at the corner, while the old woman led the little girl down a quieter side street, the very one where Brielle's café sat. They were coming toward her, and when they came closer, Brielle saw the detail she had not been able to see from a distance. The little girl was holding a yellow wildflower, the kind that grew untended in the cracks of sidewalks, and that most adults stepped over without ever seeing. She must have picked it somewhere along the way, and now she was holding it up for her grandmother to admire. Face tipped upward, eyes bright, her high little voice alive with delight. For Grandma, it's yellow like your pancakes. The old woman bent down, her wrinkled hands receiving the flower, and the smile that opened across her 72-year-old face erased every line from it for that single moment. She kissed the child on the forehead, and Brielle felt something sharp and sudden in her chest, like the sting of a needle. It wasn't jealousy. Or not only jealousy, it was an echo, a faded print of something she had once had and lost. Grandmother and granddaughter holding hands, peaceful, pure, untouched by all the dust and violence of the city around them. It reminded her of Penny, of summer on the back steps, of a gap-toothed smile. The little girl suddenly turned and noticed Brielle sitting at the table outside. Her wide eyes met Brielle's gray-blue ones, and she did what only a 5-year-old child would do. Without thinking, without hesitation, without judgment, she waved. A wide smile, small white baby teeth, a hand lifted toward a complete stranger, simply because that stranger happened to be there. Brielle blinked. No one waved at her. No one smiled at her simply because she existed. Her own hand rose, awkwardly, slowly, as though her joints had forgotten how to make such a gesture, and she waved back, her mouth curved, not quite into a smile, but into the closest thing to one her face had made in months. The old woman looked toward Brielle, gave her a small, polite nod, then led the child farther down the street. Brielle watched them go, her hand still around the coffee cup, and for that moment the world seemed gentler. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed the van. It was black, parked crooked across the street, the side door slightly open. Brielle looked at it, narrowed her eyes against the sunlight, then looked away. Delivery vans parked badly on the south side were an ordinary sight. She thought nothing of it. She had no reason to think anything of it. She took the last swallow of her coffee. The old woman and the little girl had reached the middle of the block, beyond the line of sight of the 2 bodyguards at the corner. The black van sat motionless under the sun. Its door cracked open, the darkness inside thick and still. The street was quiet. A light wind moved through the branches of the maple tree, stirring the patches of sunlight across the pavement. The little girl's laughter carried through the warm air. The world held its breath, and no one knew that in 30 seconds, everything would shatter. The screech of tires on asphalt was the first sound to tear the afternoon apart. It came without warning, sharp and violent as a blade slicing through fabric, and it made Brielle jerk so hard that she knocked her coffee cup onto the iron table. The black van, the same van she had noticed and dismissed only seconds earlier, lunged forward like a beast snapping free of its chain. The rear tires skidded sideways, the back of the van carving a black streak of rubber across the road, and the vehicle swung broadside across the narrow street exactly where the old woman and the little girl were walking. The side door flew open with a crashing metallic bang, and 3 dark figures spilled out. Black clothes, black masks, black boots. They moved fast, in coordination, like predators that had rehearsed the hunt. Not a word, not a single shout from any of them. Only the sound of shoes pounding against the pavement, 3 sets of feet driving straight toward Dorothy and Maeve. The first man reached them first, the biggest of the 3, and seized Dorothy's arm in a grip like a steel clamp. The old woman cried out, one short, sharp sound, more startled than pained, and the instinct of 72 years spent being a mother and a grandmother made her do the only thing she could do. She didn't let go of her granddaughter, but pulled Maeve into her chest and turned her own body into a shield. The second man came around behind them, reaching for Maeve. The third stood watch, his eyes sweeping the street, his right hand resting at his waist where the butt of a gun showed beneath the edge of his coat. And Maeve screamed. The scream of a 5-year-old child is unlike any other sound on earth. It has no adult filter, no restraint, no effort to preserve dignity. It is pure fear, clean and absolute, tearing through the June afternoon air like a shard of glass through silk. That scream flew across the street, struck the brick walls, ricocheted off the windows, and drove straight into Brielle Dawson's chest like a knife. And the world disappeared. Brielle was no longer sitting at an outdoor café table on a sunlit street in Chicago's South Side. She was 16 years old, standing in the 3rd-floor apartment on Ashland, where the wallpaper peeled away in strips, and the hallway light was always broken. The apartment was dark. The smell of cheap beer and sour sweat hung thick in the air. Her stepfather stood in the middle of the living room with his back to her, his shadow filling the space, shoulders wide, fists clenched, breathing heavily like a drunken bull. Penny was in the corner, 11 years old, thin as a stick, her back pressed to the wall, both hands raised to cover her face, her eyes wide as she looked through the gaps between her fingers, looked at her sister. Those eyes didn't cry for help with words. They cried for help by existing. They said, "Brielle, please, do something." And Brielle stood there, her feet fused to the floor, her hands hanging useless at her sides, her mouth open, but no sound came out. Fear is not a feeling. Fear is cement, poured into the bloodstream, hardening every muscle, turning a person into stone. Her stepfather turned, saw Penny looking toward Brielle. He roared something. Then he turned back to Penny, and his hand rose. Brielle saw all of it, saw the hand as large as half of Penny's face, saw the arc of the blow, saw Penny's eyes squeeze shut in the final instant before the impact, and she didn't thing. The sound of the strike was dull and heavy. Then the sound of Penny falling, the sound of an 11-year-old body hitting an old wooden floor. Not a crash, a thud, brief. Light in a way that was almost cruel, like fruit dropping from a branch. Then silence. And that silence had imprisoned Brielle for 11 years. Every night, every nightmare, every time she looked at the photograph on the wall, every time she called the nursing home and heard the nurse say Penny didn't recognize anyone. That silence was the sentence. That silence was the prison. That silence was her. Maeve's second scream shattered all of it. Brielle tore out of the flashback like someone being dragged up from the water in the last instant before drowning. Chicago sunlight slammed into her eyes. Color rushed back. Sound rushed back. And she saw. The biggest man was dragging Dorothy. The old woman was clinging to Maeve, refusing to let go. The second man was wrenching at her arm, trying to tear the child away. Maeve turned her head, face crumpled with tears, and looked toward Brielle. Those eyes. Dear God. Those eyes. Not the same color, not the same shape, but the same thing inside them. The same wordless cry. The same look through the gaps between raised fingers. Please. Please. Somebody do something. And this time, cement didn't pour into Brielle Dawson's veins. This time, what poured in was fire. No. The word was only a whisper, a breath. No, no, no. Not this time. Brielle didn't remember when she stood up. She didn't remember overturning the table or stepping around it. Her body moved before her mind could give the command. 11 years of buried guilt igniting in a single instant and hurling her forward with a force she could not resist. Her eyes swept the scene, her survival brain working at a speed reason could not follow. the iron patio table and chairs, the chair she had just been sitting in. She seized it with both hands, lifted it, and smashed it against the iron edge of the table. Metal crashed against metal with a ringing force. The chair jolted, the impact shuddering up her arms, but she struck it again and again, until one of the chair legs snapped free. A length of iron about 2 feet long, jagged and sharp at the broken end, rust spreading across its surface, heavy, crude, and it fit in her palm as if it had been made for it. Brielle turned back toward the street. The 3 masked men were dragging Dorothy and Maeve toward the van. The old woman struggled weakly. Maeve was sobbing. No one helped. The fruit vendor at the corner stood frozen, mouth hanging open, hands limp at his sides. The elderly couple with the dog had vanished. The street was empty. Only them, the old woman, the child, and her. Brielle tightened her grip on the iron chair leg and ran toward the sound of crying. Brielle didn't scream as she charged forward. There was no battle cry, no warning. She ran in silence, the worn soles of her shoes striking the asphalt, the rusted iron rod clutched tight in her right hand, and that silence was more terrifying than any shout could have been. The first man didn't see her coming. He was dragging Dorothy by the arm, his face turned toward the van, focused only on shoving the old woman through the sliding door. Brielle didn't aim for his head or his body. She aimed for his hand, for the wrist that was gripping the old woman. 11 years of surviving on the South Side had not taught her martial arts, but it had taught her something more important. Strike where it makes a man unable to hold on. She swung the iron rod in a short horizontal arc, putting all her strength into the instant of impact. The jagged rusted end slammed into his wrist just above the radius bone. The crack came dry and sharp, like a stick snapping in two. He screamed. A broken sound filled more with shock than pain, his hand releasing Dorothy as his whole body staggered backward, his face turning white beneath the mask. The pistol at his waist slipped free and hit the sidewalk, metal clattering against concrete. Dorothy reeled but didn't fall. She clutched Maeve tightly and backed toward the wall, her old eyes wide as she stared at Brielle like she was looking at something she could not understand. The second man reacted faster. He turned, saw his partner stumbling away, clutching a shattered wrist, saw the girl in the black uniform holding the iron rod, and came straight at her. He was quick, but Brielle didn't need to be quicker. She needed to be more precise. When he came within reach, she didn't swing sideways. She thrust straight ahead. She drove the iron rod forward like a spear, and the broken point punched into his left thigh just above the knee, where the muscle was thickest and the blood vessels ran close beneath the surface. He howled, his leg buckled. Both hands flew to the rod buried in his thigh by reflex, and he went down face first onto the sidewalk, his groans choking off beneath the mask. 2 men. 4 seconds. Brielle was breathing hard now, her chest rising and falling, her eyes already shifting toward the third man. The leader. And the leader wasn't like the other 2. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He had moved while Brielle was taking down his partners, retreating toward Dorothy and Maeve, and now his left hand gripped Dorothy's arm, dragging the old woman in front of him like a living shield. In his right hand was a gun, the barrel aimed at Brielle, his eyes above the black mask, cold and calculating. This wasn't a rattled hireling. This was a man who had done this before. "I'll kill you." He didn't shout. He spoke in a low, clear voice, each word cutting like a blade. "Then I'll shoot the old woman. Then I'll smash the little girl's head against the sidewalk. Is that what you want? Move." Aside. Brielle stood 4 steps away from him. The iron rod in her hand was smeared with the blood of the second man, dark red across the orange rust. Her breathing rasped. Sweat and street dust clung to her face. She looked at Dorothy, trembling in his grip, and the old woman was staring back at her in horror, but not horror at the violence itself. Horror because she was afraid this young woman was about to die for her. Then Brielle looked at Maeve. The child stood behind Dorothy, the crushed yellow wildflower still clenched in her hand, her face blurred with tears, her tiny body shaking like a leaf in a storm. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was too frightened even to scream. Brielle shifted to the left, keeping her body between the gun and the grandmother and child. The leader fired. The shot tore through the afternoon air, deafening, ricocheting off the brick walls on either side of the street. The bullet grazed Brielle's left temple, close enough that she felt its heat like a finger of fire dragged across her skin. Blood came at once. A dark red line burst from the edge of her hairline and ran down her temple, her cheek, her chin, dripping onto the collar of her black uniform. Pain. Sharp, blinding, as if someone had drawn a red-hot wire along the side of her skull. Brielle staggered half a step, her vision blurred for a fraction of a second. Then it cleared, and she didn't retreat. The pain didn't drive her backward. It burned away the last layer of fog, incinerated what remained of fear, of hesitation, of the instinct to protect herself. What was left was a focus so pure it was almost unnatural. She straightened, blood running down her face. Her fixed stare was locked directly on the eyes of the man with the gun, the sharpened end of the iron rod pointed at his throat. And this was that moment. The moment that opened this story. A diner waitress, standing in the middle of a sunlit street on Chicago's South Side, blood on her face, a rusted iron rod in her hand, planted between a gun barrel and an old woman holding her granddaughter. Now everything was clear. 14 hours earlier, she had been a ghost eating porridge alone at 4 a.m. 11 years earlier, she had been a child frozen in place while her sister fell. And now, on this blistering sidewalk, she was the person who would never stand and watch again. The standoff stretched on. 10 seconds passed like 10 years. The man with the gun looked into her eyes and saw something he had never seen in all his years as hired muscle. Not courage. He had seen courage before. This was something else. This was the absolute certainty, perfect and without a single crack, of a human being who had accepted death and turned that acceptance into a weapon. She would not retreat. He could shoot her, but she would not retreat. And in the instant he understood that, for the first time, the man with the gun felt fear. He was calculating. Shoot, run, or try one more time to drag the old woman away. He had not yet decided when a new sound cut across every calculation. Engines. Not one. Several. Powerful. And coming very, very fast. 3 glossy black SUVs surged into both ends of the street at the same time, precise as 3 knives driven into a single point. Tires screamed. Front ends swung sideways. In an instant, they formed a wall of steel that sealed off every exit. The engines had not even fully died when the doors opened. In perfect unison. 6 doors, 6 men, 6 perfectly tailored black suits, stepping out as though they had all been cast from the same mold. Each one held a handgun fitted with a suppressor, the barrel angled down along his thigh, his finger already resting on the trigger. They didn't move in haste, but neither did they move slowly. They moved with the cold precision of wolves that had already decided which prey would die first. The air on the street changed in that moment. The chaotic violence of the attempted abduction, the screams, the gunshot, the blood on Brielle's face, all of it was suddenly replaced by something heavier, colder, far more dangerous: authority. The kind of authority that does not need to announce itself, because it is present in every footstep, every clean line of a suit, every steady gun barrel pointed without the slightest tremor. The leader recognized it first. His eyes left Brielle and swept toward the convoy, and what Brielle saw happen inside those eyes was collapse. Not fear arriving slowly. Collapse all at once, like a building with its foundation ripped away. He recognized the emblem on the vehicles. He knew who these men were, and he knew he was dead. The rear door of the lead SUV opened, and Jude Concincaid stepped out. He didn't run. He walked, each stride long, even, deliberate, the soles of his leather shoes striking the asphalt with the rhythm of a man strolling through his own garden. And that slowness was what made him terrifying. It said that he was in no hurry because he knew no one on that street could go anywhere. It said that the ending had been written before he ever stepped out of the car. It said that from this moment forward, everything belonged entirely in his hands. Jude's eyes moved over the scene, the man clutching his broken wrist, moaning against the wall. The man with the punctured thigh sprawled face down on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath him. The leader standing rigid, gun still in hand but the barrel lowered now, as if he had forgotten he was even holding it. 3 men hired for 30 seconds of work had been reduced to 3 wrecks in front of him. Then Jude's eyes found his mother and his daughter. Dorothy stood against the wall, one arm around Maeve, her face pale but her spine still straight. Maeve was crying into her grandmother's chest, her tiny body shaking. A flash of emotion cut through Jude's mask of ice. Quick, violent, raw, his hand clenched into a fist, the muscles in his neck rising for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening until the muscle at his temple jumped beneath the skin. Then it was gone. Control returned, the mask sealed shut again. But in that brief instant, Brielle had seen it. She had seen the father. Jude's eyes moved to her, And he looked for a long moment, looked at the faded black server's uniform streaked with street dust, looked at the worn-out sneakers, looked at the line of blood running from her temple to her chin, red against pale skin gone almost blue-white, looked at the rusted iron rod in her hand, the sharpened end stained with blood, gripped with such a desperate force that her hand seemed to become part of the metal itself, looked at the gray-blue eyes that didn't blink, didn't lower, didn't ask permission. He understood. In a single look, he understood everything. She wasn't a bodyguard, not a police officer, not someone paid, trained, or ordered to be here. She was a diner waitress who had happened to walk by and had chosen to stay, chosen to take on 3 armed men with a rusted iron rod, chosen to take a bullet grazing her head without giving up half a step. For his mother, for his daughter. Vaughn was beside Jude before Brielle even realized he had moved, silent, expressionless. He gave the slightest nod to the team. Everything happened so fast it was nearly simultaneous. 2 men moved toward the one with the broken wrist, disarmed him, cuffed him, and hauled him upright without a word. 2 others handled the one with the pierced thigh, stopping the bleeding just enough, then lifting him into one of the 3 SUVs. The leader stood in the middle of the street with a gun in his hand, looking at the convoy, at the 6 men, at Jude Concincaid, and in the final instant of his desperation, he did the stupidest thing possible. He raised the gun, not toward Brielle, toward Jude. The barrel had not even reached waist level when a small, soft sound, neat and compact, like the pop of a bottle cap, came from Vaughn's direction. A black round hole appeared in the center of the man's forehead, just above the bridge of his nose, precise as a period at the end of a sentence. His eyes went wide. Then he fell, crumpled as if someone had cut the strings of a puppet, knees folding, body twisting, face striking the asphalt without a sound. Then silence. A silence more frightening than gunfire. Jude's team never stopped moving. The leader's body was wrapped in a black tarp, lifted, and placed into the trunk of a vehicle. Sand was poured over the blood on the pavement and swept clean. One of the men drove away in the kidnapper's black van. Shell casings were collected. The broken chair fragments were gathered up. In less than 3 minutes, the street returned to normal, as if nothing had happened, as if the violence had only been a nightmare in broad daylight and everyone had awakened and forgotten it. Dorothy released Maeve and rushed toward Brielle, then threw her arms around her, not a polite embrace. She held her with both trembling arms, tightly enough that Brielle could feel the old woman's frantic heartbeat through the fabric of her clothes. She took Brielle's hand, gripped it hard, and would not let go, even when the medics who had arrived quietly with the ambulance began cleaning the blood and bandaging the wound at Brielle's temple. Dorothy stayed beside her. The wrinkled hand of the old woman held Brielle's rough one as though she were holding something sacred. Then Maeve stepped forward. She didn't run. She walked, slowly, her eyes swollen and red, her cheeks smeared with tears, but she had stopped crying. She came to a halt in front of Brielle and tilted her face up to look at the young woman who was 22 years older than she was, with those round eyes still wet. Then she held out her hand. In her tiny palm, crushed and wrinkled but still keeping its yellow color, lay the wildflower. The flower she had picked for her grandmother before the world shattered. She had held on to it the whole time, through the screaming, through the tears, through the fear, her 5-year-old hand clenched tight around its fragile petals. For you, because you were brave. Brielle looked at the flower, then at Maeve, then at the flower again. Her hand reached out, slowly, trembling, and received the crushed wildflower from the child's palm. The petals were thin as paper, warm from Maeve's body heat, so light they were almost weightless, and it was the first gift Brielle Dawson had received in many years. She could not remember the last time someone had given her something without asking for something in return. She held the flower in her calloused palm, and something in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 11 years, began to crack. Then he came. Jude Concincaid stopped 3 steps away from Brielle, and those 3 steps felt like 3 miles no one could cross. His presence was unlike anyone she had ever met in her life. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, it was like gravity, an invisible force drawing everything around him inward, without requiring him to move so much as a finger. The scent of expensive cologne drifted through the air, mingling with the smell of leather shoes and something colder. The scent of real power, the kind that needs no announcement, because it is already written into every line of a black suit, and every cord in the back of a man's hand. His eyes settled on her, and the way Jude Concincaid looked at a person was nothing like the way ordinary people looked. He read, as if he were reading a report, from the bottom up, the sneakers worn thin at the heels, the sole beginning to separate from the right toe, the kind of shoes bought at a second-hand store for less than the cost of one of his lunches, the faded black server's uniform, slightly torn at the left elbow, streaked with street dust and dried blood, the rough hands with calluses across the palms, the right hand gripping the crushed yellow wildflower with a desperate force, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the world, the left hanging at her side where the rusted iron rod had already been taken away by the medics, the fresh white bandage around her temple, already stained with a small pink bloom where the bullet had grazed her, and finally, the eyes, shadowed eyes that didn't lower, didn't ask permission, and didn't fear, bone-tired, yet unbroken. The eyes of someone who had faced down a gun for his mother and his daughter, and would do it again if she had to. He finished reading, and he understood more than the eye could simply see. He understood that the worn sneakers didn't only mean poverty but choice, money saved for somewhere else, for someone else. He understood that the calloused hands were not the hands of a lazy person, but the hands of someone who worked until the skin could not grow back fast enough. He understood that the eyes that would not lower were not arrogance, but what remained after fear had burned itself out. They told me what you did. Jude's voice was low and resonant, not warm but weighted. It wasn't a thank you. It was a statement of fact, the way a man accustomed to giving orders confirms information before making a decision. Brielle nodded. A small nod. She was too exhausted to speak. The adrenaline had left her long ago, leaving behind a weariness that had seeped all the way into her bones. But she looked straight into his eyes. She had faced a gun this afternoon. She would not fear a stare. Jude stepped one pace closer. 2 steps now remained between them. The space separating them turned thick. "My mother and my daughter," he said, each word falling heavy as stone. "There is no price that can measure them. You protected the 2 most important people in my life. That creates a debt money cannot repay." He paused. His eyes remained on her, but now he was no longer reading. He was looking through the faded uniform, through the exhaustion, through the wall of silence she had built over 11 years, into the hollow places inside her, the places the past had carved out and left empty. "You have nothing," he said it without cruelty, only with precision sharp enough to hurt. "You live in a box. You fight like someone who has nothing left to lose because you believe you already lost everything." Brielle didn't answer, but her jaw tightened, because he was right, and the accuracy of it felt like salt poured into an open wound. "You're wrong," he said. Then he lifted a hand, not toward her, but in a gesture that took in the world around him, the convoy, the men, the street already wiped clean of violence in 3 minutes. His world. "I'm not repaying you with money. I'm giving you something money cannot buy. Purpose." His voice dropped another note. "My mother and my daughter need someone to protect them. Not bodyguards standing 30 steps away while the 2 of them get grabbed in broad daylight. Someone who stands beside them. Someone with the will to do what must be done when everyone else runs." He looked directly into her eyes. "Your pain. I can give it a target. 11 years. For 11 years, Brielle had lived inside the box, had gone from work to home, to porridge, to sleep, and then risen to do it all again. Had kept the world at a distance behind a wall of silence, had called that safety, had called that living. And now, standing on a south side sidewalk with dried blood at her temple and a crushed flower in her hand, a mafia king was telling her that none of those things had been living at all. Reason screamed inside her. Walk away. Go back to Rosie's. Go back to the bowl of porridge at 4 a.m. Go back to the familiar safety of belonging to no one, owing no one, losing no one else. She knew who Jude Concincaid was. Everyone on the south side knew. Mob boss, killer, king of darkness. To accept his offer was to step into a world whose door opened only one way. But then she looked to the side. Dorothy sat on the steps nearby, Maeve curled in her lap, Mr. Whiskers clutched tight, her eyes dry now but still red, her head resting against her grandmother's chest, and the child was looking at Brielle. A small smile, tired but full of absolute trust. The kind of trust only a 5-year-old can give. The kind of trust Penny had once placed in her, before that night, and Brielle understood. Her safety had not been safety at all. It had been a prison. She had locked herself inside that box for 11 years and called it peace. But in truth, she had been hiding. Hiding from the world because she was afraid to fail one more time. But today, on this street, she had not hidden. For the first time in 11 years, she had chosen to stay. And that feeling, terrifying and painful, but alive, was more real than any day in the more than 4,000 days since the night she ran from the apartment on Ashland. Brielle turned back to Jude. She didn't say yes. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything at all. She only nodded, slowly, heavily, like someone stepping through a doorway knowing the one behind her would never open again. Jude looked at her, and for the first time, in those steel-gray eyes, there was something other than calculation. He gave a single nod in return. The agreement was signed in silence, between a diner waitress and the underground king of Chicago, on a sidewalk still carrying the faint smell of gunpowder, beneath the June afternoon light as it slowly began to fade. The Concincaid estate stood in the northern suburbs of Chicago, hidden behind a 10-foot iron fence and 2 layers of security gates, so that from the main road all anyone could see were old oak trees in shadow. The black SUV brought Brielle there at dusk, just as the last of the sunset was fading from the gray, tiled roof of the 3-story house. She stepped out of the vehicle with her server's uniform still dust-stained, a white bandage on her temple, and a plastic bag in her hand containing everything she owned from the studio apartment, a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the photograph of the 2 sisters on the summer steps. Nothing else. 27 years of life, reduced to a plastic bag lighter than a bag of trash. Her room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of the eastern hall, beside Dorothy's room and Maeve's. When the door opened, Brielle stopped at the threshold and didn't step inside for almost a full minute. The room was 4 times the size of her studio. Pale oak floors, a large window overlooking the garden, white curtains stirring softly in the evening breeze, a double bed with spotless white sheets, thick pillows, and a soft blanket folded neatly at the foot, a walnut nightstand, a reading lamp, a small glass vase with no flowers in it yet, and a private bathroom. Brielle walked into the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and water came out immediately, hot, steady, not dripping 1 drop at a time, not yellowed, no rust stains in the sink. She stood there watching the water run for a very long time, far longer than any ordinary person would watch a faucet, because it was the first time in her life that Brielle Dawson had ever had a bathroom of her own with a tap that didn't leak. She didn't cry, but she swallowed very slowly, and when she turned back to the bedroom, the first thing she did was take the crushed yellow wildflower out of the pocket of her uniform. The petals had wilted, the stem was bent, but the yellow color remained. She placed the flower in the glass vase on the nightstand and poured half a glass of water into it. The flower leaned to one side, fragile, almost meaningless, but under the warm light, it was the only thing in the room that truly belonged to her. The first morning came with a knock at the door at 5 o'clock. Not Dorothy, not Vaughn. It was a small, elderly man standing in the hallway, no more than 5'3", so thin that his white training clothes hung from him like fabric draped over a pole. His silver hair was cut close to his scalp. His face was full of wrinkles, but his eyes were bright and still as a windless lake. He didn't introduce himself. He only said one sentence in a voice as soft as falling leaves. "Training room, 5 minutes." Then he turned and walked away. Mr. Cho. Brielle would learn his name later. She would learn that he was a master of more than 10 martial arts disciplines and had once trained Special Forces soldiers before coming under the protection of the Concincaid family. But that morning, all she knew was that a small old man had told her to come downstairs to the training room. The gym was in the basement, wide and open, with wood floors, mirrors on 3 walls, and racks of wooden weapons lined along the sides. Mr. Cho stood in the middle of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Brielle walked in wearing a t-shirt and sleep pants, the bandage on her temple not yet removed, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. He looked at her. Not with judgment, only with observation. "Attack me." Brielle blinked. "What?" "Attack me. With everything you have." She looked at him. He was a thin old man, smaller than she was, shorter than she was, a man who looked as though a hard wind might carry him away. But there was something in his eyes, something unnaturally still, that kept her from dismissing him. So she attacked. With everything. With the same way she had fought on the street the day before, instinctive, brutal, aimed at joints, wrists, eyes. She threw a punch at him, pivoted, swung a kick, and Mr. Cho wasn't there. Every strike she launched met only air. He moved so lightly it was almost as if he didn't move at all, only tilting half a step, turning a shoulder by an inch, and every punch, every kick, every lunge of hers slid past him the way water slides around stone. Then he touched her, one finger, placed on her wrist. And with a motion Brielle could not even understand, he turned, pulled, and she was flat on the wooden floor staring at the ceiling. The breath knocked clean out of her lungs, unable to understand what had just happened. She got angry. That familiar anger, black and hot, the same anger that had helped her survive on the streets, helped her seize the iron rod and charge 3 armed men. She pushed herself up and came at him again, harder, faster, more reckless. The result was exactly the same. Wood floor, ceiling, breathless lungs. The second time, the third, the fourth. Each time she rushed him with more force, more fury, and each time he laid her down on the floor more gently, as though he were teaching her a lesson by softening his response in exact proportion to how much harder she came at him. By the 5th time, Brielle was lying on the floor panting, her shirt soaked with sweat, the anger still burning but her body spent. She slammed her fist against the wooden boards, pain flaring through her knuckles, and didn't get up. Mr. Cho crouched beside her, gently, patiently, like someone sitting with a crying child and waiting for the tears to pass. "You are strong," he said. His voice didn't praise. It only observed. "But you fight with pain. Pain is good fuel. It burns hot. It burns hard. But it runs out. And when it runs out, you will stand in the middle of battle with empty hands." He placed his small, dry, calloused hand on top of hers, over the knuckles she had just driven into the floor. "I will teach you to fight with will. Will never runs out. It does not burn. It flows, like water. Water is softer than stone, but water cuts mountains." Brielle lay still, looking at the ceiling. Her breathing slowly evened out. She didn't understand everything he meant, but she understood one thing. She had just lost. Lost completely, and for the first time in her life, she had lost to someone who didn't hurt her. And that moment of defeat, on the wooden floor of the training room beneath the Concincaid estate, with the yellow wildflower upstairs slowly wilting in its vase, was the first brick laid in the foundation of the person Brielle Dawson would become. The first few days passed in a new rhythm Brielle had not yet grown used to. Mornings training with Mr. Cho, afternoons beside Dorothy and Maeve. Her body ached from the training sessions, but it was a pain with purpose, different from the dull ache she had carried for 11 years. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Brielle sat on the sofa in the family room on the 2nd floor, watching Maeve lie on her stomach on the rug drawing. The child had a box of 64 crayons Dorothy had bought for her, and she used them with the absolute seriousness of a 5-year-old artist creating a masterpiece. Brielle said nothing. She only sat there, back straight, hands resting on her thighs, observing. Dorothy sat in the armchair across from them, knitting, glancing up now and then to smile at her granddaughter, before looking over at Brielle with an expression the younger woman had not yet learned to read. 15 minutes later, Maeve sprang up, her face dotted with streaks of blue crayon on one cheek, and held up the paper with both hands. "It's done, Miss Brie. Look." Brielle took the paper and stared at it for a long time. The drawing showed 3 people holding hands on green ground beneath a yellow sun that took up half the page. The smallest figure on the left had black curls and a huge smile. Maeve. The figure in the middle had white hair and a cream-colored dress. Dorothy. The figure on the right had brown hair, wore black clothes, and was the tallest of all. Above that figure's head, in the crooked letters of a child just learning to write, were 2 words. Miss Brie. 3 people holding hands. Brielle looked at the drawing, and her finger traced the crayon line connecting the 3 hands. The line wasn't straight. It wobbled. It broke in one place where the crayon had jumped off the paper. But the 3 hands never let go of one another. In Maeve's crayon world, these 3 people belonged together. Dorothy watched Brielle's reaction from the armchair and set her knitting down. "She draws you every day since you came," she said gently. Before that, she only drew 2 people, herself and me. Brielle didn't answer. She lowered the drawing onto her lap, her face unchanged, but her finger still rested on the crayon line joining the 3 hands. Dorothy knitted a few more stitches, then spoke again, her voice lower now, like someone telling a story beside a fire. "Catherine liked to draw too. My daughter-in-law drew beautifully, Landscapes, flowers, portraits of Maeve when she was first born. This house used to be full of Catherine's paintings. Jude put them all away after she died. He kept only one in his study. She stopped knitting, looked out the window. When Catherine died, Jude died too. What is left, the part that sits at breakfast with his mother and smiles at his daughter, that is only fragments. Most of my son was buried with Catherine, and the part still walking grows more like a machine than a man every day. She turned back to look at Brielle. Her eyes, 72 years old and still bright and keen, read the young woman with the kind of gaze only a mother and grandmother can have. You too, aren't you? Brielle looked up. You lost someone too, and you buried a part of yourself with them. Silence. Then Dorothy asked, her voice soft as breath. Your family, child. Do you have anyone? Ice. Brielle froze, not gradually, instantly, as if someone had poured liquid nitrogen into her veins. Her eyes went blank, her shoulders locked. The hand resting on the crayon, drawing tightened, wrinkling the edge of the paper. She stood, set the drawing down on the sofa, said, I'm sorry, in a voice so flat it was almost unnatural, and walked out of the room. She didn't run. She only walked. But each step was quicker than the one before, and by the time she reached the hallway she was almost running. Dorothy watched her go, sighed softly, and didn't follow. She understood walls. She lived every day with a man who had built one just like that. But Maeve didn't understand walls. She only saw Miss Brielle leave and forget the drawing behind. The child picked the paper up from the sofa, hugged it to her chest, and ran into the hallway on little legs faster than Brielle had imagined. Miss Brielle, wait. You forgot this. Brielle stopped in the middle of the hall, turned back, and looked down. Maeve stood there, breathing hard from running, both hands holding the drawing high over her head, her face tipped upward, her wide eyes fixed on Brielle without understanding why she had left but certain of one thing alone, that she had to have this drawing. It's yours. You forgot it. Brielle looked at the child, looked at the drawing. 3 people holding hands. Miss Brielle written in crooked blue crayon. She knelt down. Slowly, her knees touched the wooden floor. Her eyes came level with Maeve's, and she reached out to take the drawing. Her hand was shaking visibly, plainly, the kind of trembling nothing can hide. She held the drawing in both hands as if she were holding something more fragile than glass, and said, Thank you, sweetheart. In a voice so quiet Maeve had to tilt her head to hear it. The child smiled. A wide smile, baby teeth, without suspicion, without condition. Then she hugged Brielle around the neck for 1 second and ran back toward Dorothy's room, leaving the 27-year-old woman kneeling in the hallway, holding the crayon drawing, looking at 3 people holding hands, while the crack in the fortress widened a little more. That night, Brielle sat on the sofa reading to Maeve before bed because Dorothy had asked her to, and she didn't know how to refuse the older woman. She read in a level voice, without drama, without rise or fall, but Maeve didn't care. The child curled up beside her, head resting against her arm. Mr. Whiskers clutched tight in her lap and listened. By the 7th page, Brielle realized Maeve had fallen asleep. There had been no warning, no announcement of sleepiness. The child had simply grown heavier against her arm, her breathing lengthening, evening out, softening into the complete surrender of childhood sleep, the kind of sleep without nightmares, without worry, the kind that trusts the world enough to let go of every defense. Brielle sat perfectly still. She didn't dare move. Maeve's steady breathing against her arm was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard in her life. More peaceful than the silence in her studio apartment, because the silence in the studio had been the absence of sound, but this breathing was the presence of life, of trust, of a 5-year-old child choosing to sleep on her arm because she believed Brielle would not let her fall. Brielle sat there for a long time, the book still open in her lap, Maeve curled against her arm, the crayon drawing taped to the wall upstairs beside the photograph of 2 sisters on summer steps, and at the far end of the hallway, where shadow met yellow lamplight, Jude Concincaid stood motionless. How long he had been there, Brielle didn't know. He didn't step inside. He didn't speak. He only stood there, one shoulder against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, and watched. Watched his daughter sleeping on the arm of a diner waitress whose name he had not known 1 week earlier. Watched the peace on Maeve's face. Watched Brielle's hand resting lightly on the child's back, keeping her from slipping. a gesture so instinctive she didn't know she possessed it. He said nothing, but he didn't walk away either. And sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words. In the second week, Brielle asked Dorothy for permission to go out for half a day. Dorothy didn't ask where she was going. She only nodded, held Brielle's hand for a second, then let it go. Vaughn drove her to Greenfield Nursing Home on the west side of the city, the place she had called at the end of every shift for years, but had only been able to visit once every few months because her work schedule never allowed more. The nursing home was housed in an old 4-story brick building, with long hallways, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with the scent of bland food. A nurse led Brielle to the third-floor common room. Penny sat in a wheelchair by the window, exactly as the nurses had described her over the phone every time Brielle called. Her eyes were turned outward but fixed on nothing. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers twitching now and then to a rhythm only her damaged brain could hear. 22 years old, thin, brown hair cut short for ease of care. Her face still carried the lines of the gap-toothed 9-year-old girl laughing on the summer steps. But her eyes didn't. Those eyes had gone out 11 years earlier, the moment her head struck the wooden floor of the apartment on Ashland. Brielle pulled up a chair and sat beside her sister. She took Penny's hand. Her sister's hand was soft, warm, but didn't squeeze back, didn't respond. It was like holding the hand of someone asleep without dreams. Penny. Brielle's voice was soft, rough, as though it had forgotten how to say this name aloud. "It's me, Bri." No response. Penny's eyes stayed on the window, where sunlight fell across the nursing home lawn and the low iron fence beyond it. Brielle swallowed, tightened her hold on her sister's hand, and for the first time in 11 years, she told her, "I found a place, Penny. I have my own room. I have a bathroom where the faucet doesn't leak." She gave a small laugh, dry and strange on her lips. "There's an old woman named Dorothy who makes pancakes every morning. There's a 5-year-old girl named Maeve who keeps drawing pictures for me with crayons. She draws me holding her hand." She paused, breathed. "I'm learning how to be stronger. There's an old man teaching me. He says I'm strong, but I fight with pain. He says pain runs out. I don't know yet if he's right or wrong." She looked down at Penny's hand in hers. "I'm sorry, Penny. I'm sorry about that night. I'm sorry I stood there and didn't think. I'm sorry I ran." Her voice broke on the last word, and then Penny's fingers tightened. Slightly, so slightly that if Brielle had not already been holding her hand, she would never have felt it. Just a muscle spasm, the nurse would have said. Just an involuntary reflex. But Brielle felt it, and she believed it. And the dam that had first cracked on the street, that had been split further by the wildflower, shaken by the crayon drawing, loosened by Maeve's breathing in sleep, finally broke. Brielle Dawson cried, not for 60 seconds. Not in the corner of Rosie's diner kitchen. Not the kind of crying she allowed and then shut off. She cried for real. Shoulders shaking, breath catching, tears running down her cheeks and falling onto Penny's hand. And she didn't count. For the first time in years, she let the pain pour out without putting a limit on it. On the drive back, Vaughn drove in silence. When they were nearly at the estate, he spoke in his usual even, emotionless voice. "Miss Dawson, Mr. Concincaid has arranged for Miss Penny to be transferred to Lakeshore Institute. Private room. Top neurologists. All expenses covered by Mr. Concincaid. Effective next Monday." Brielle went still in the back seat. Then she got angry. Not slowly. Instantly. Hot and sharp. She told Vaughn to stop the car at the front entrance, walked straight into Jude's study, and didn't knock. Jude was seated behind the black desk, the screens glowing, his cold eyes lifting when she burst in. "I don't need charity." Brielle said it with a voice trembling from anger, not fear. "My sister is not a tool for you to keep me here." Jude looked at her, not angry, not surprised, completely calm, like a man who had expected this reaction all along. "That is not charity. That is investment." He spoke in a flat voice. "You cannot protect my family if every night you lie awake wondering whether there will be enough money for your sister's care at the end of the month. You cannot focus if your mind is being torn apart by a worry I have the power to remove. I remove the interfering variable. Don't confuse strategy with kindness." Brielle stared at him for a long time. She wanted to argue, wanted to throw every one of his words back in his face. But deep down, in the place pride could not reach, she knew he was right. And his being right made her angrier, because it meant she owed him one more debt that could not be measured. She walked out without another word. That night, close to midnight, Brielle could not sleep. She went down the first-floor hallway to get water, and as she passed the closed room in the west wing, she heard Jude's voice. She stopped. Through the crack in the half-open door, yellow light spilled out, and she saw. A man was kneeling on the floor, his hands tied behind his back, his face bruised, his white shirt stained with blood. Jude sat across from him in a chair, one leg crossed over the other, his hands resting on his thigh, his head tilted slightly, and he was speaking. His voice was gentle, calm, almost tender, the same voice he had used when he told Maeve that her mother loved roses. But the subject wasn't roses. The subject was names, dates, sums of money, betrayal, and consequences. Every word was as precise as a scalpel, never rising, never falling, and that calmness was more frightening than any shout could have been. Vaughn stood behind him, expressionless. The man on the floor was begging, his voice choking. Jude gave Vaughn the slightest nod. Brielle walked away, quickly, before the sound came from behind her. She went back to her room, lay on the bed, and stared up at the ceiling in the dark. Protecting a family or serving a killer? Where was the line? Was there a line at all? Or was she lying to herself that there was one so she could sleep more easily? She turned her head to the side. On the wall, beside the photograph of the two sisters on the summer steps, hung the crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands. Mrs. Dorothy, Maeve, Miss Brie, and Brielle understood. Her compass wasn't Jude, not the Empire, not money or power or the underworld. Her compass was the old woman who made pancakes every morning, and the 5-year-old child who believed purple butterflies could fly through clouds. She was here for them, only for them. And as long as that compass kept pointing true, she would stay. 3 days after the night Brielle had seen the darkness through the crack in the door, her phone vibrated at 10 o'clock at night. Unknown number, no text message, only a photograph. Brielle opened it, and the blood inside her turned to ice. It was a picture of Penny, taken from outside her window at Lakeshore Institute, where Jude had moved her less than a week earlier. The angle was slanted, shot through the glass, the fluorescent light inside casting a pale glow over Penny sitting in her wheelchair, staring outward. Whoever had taken the photograph had been standing no more than 2 steps from the window, close enough to show the lines in Penny's hand resting in her lap. There was no message attached. None was needed. The photograph was a complete message all by itself. We know where your sister is. We got close enough to touch her. And we want you to know that. Brielle sat on the bed staring at the photograph for a long time. Her fingers tightened around the phone until the plastic case creaked. But she didn't panic. She had passed beyond panic on that afternoon in the sunlit street, when the bullet grazed her temple, and she had not stepped back. What she felt now wasn't fear. It was anger. Cold. Still. The kind of anger Mr. Cho was teaching her to transform into will. She rose, walked down the hall, and stopped in front of Jude's study door. The last time, she had burst in because she was furious. This time, she knocked. 2 knocks. Short, clear. The door opened. Jude sat behind the black desk, the screens glowing, his eyes on the data in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and Brielle noticed that he wasn't surprised, as though he had expected her to come, only didn't know whether it would be tonight or tomorrow night. Brielle placed the phone on his desk, screen facing up, Penny's photograph shining beneath the cold light. They know about my sister. 6 words. No trembling, no pleading, no demands. Only a fact laid down between them on the desk, waiting to be handled. Jude picked up the phone and looked at the photograph. His eyes narrowed. Not much. Only enough for Brielle to realize that he was calculating at a speed she could not follow. He set the phone down, lifted the desk phone, and dialed a number. Vaughn. Lakeshore Institute. Transfer Miss Penny Dawson to Delta Facility tonight. Level 2 protection. 2 men inside, 2 outside. Effective immediately. He hung up. Looked at Brielle. Your sister is under my protection now. No one will touch her. No ornament. No promise. A statement of fact. The way he said everything, like reading out a sentence already signed. And Brielle answered. Not with thanks. My mother and my daughter are under my protection. No one will touch them. She said it in a voice so calm it almost sounded like his. And in that moment, for the first time since she had crossed the threshold of the Concincaid estate, the look between them was balanced. No longer a crime lord looking down at a rescued waitress. No longer a master and an employee. It was 2 people standing level, each holding the most precious thing in the other's life in their hands, and both of them knowing that if one failed, both would lose everything. Respect. Real respect. For the first time, Jude nodded. Then he did something that even Vaughn, who had served him for 12 years, had rarely been allowed to witness. He opened the desk drawer, took out a file, and laid it on the surface of the desk, turning it toward Brielle. Maps, schematics, schedules, names, and photographs. Reno Volkov is preparing an attack, not on a shipment, on this house. He tapped the estate map with one finger. He'll use his main force to draw me out, then send a secondary team into the house. The targets are still my mother and Maeve. He shared everything with her. Formation, weak points, counterattack plans, information that no one besides Vaughn had ever heard directly from Jude Kincaid's mouth. Brielle listened, memorized. She didn't ask why he trusted her enough to share it. The answer came at the end of the conversation, when Jude closed the file, looked at her, and spoke in a voice she almost didn't recognize because it lacked the usual layer of ice. When it starts, I won't be here. I'll be out there dealing with Reno. The estate will have only the core security team and you. He paused. You are the last line. If everything collapses, if security fails, if the walls are breached, you are the only one standing between them and my mother, my daughter. He looked directly at her. You are the only person I trust not to run. 11 years earlier, Brielle had run. She had left Penny behind in the dark apartment and fled. And she had lived with that wound every day. Now the most powerful man in Chicago was placing his mother and his daughter in her hands because he believed she would not make that mistake again. And he was right. She would not. Brielle nodded, said nothing more. That night, very late, when the estate had gone still, Brielle passed Maeve's room on the way back to her own. The door stood slightly open, and the butterfly-shaped nightlight was casting a soft purple glow across the ceiling, and Jude was standing there, beside his daughter's bed. The mask of ice was completely gone. No crime lord, no king of darkness, no man sitting in a closed room interrogating a traitor in that terrifyingly gentle voice. Only a father standing over his sleeping daughter, and afraid, truly afraid. The kind of fear power cannot shield against, that guns cannot protect from, that money cannot buy peace from. He knew Brielle was standing in the doorway. He didn't turn around. He only said, in a voice so low it sounded almost as though he were speaking to himself, "If I don't come back, you know what to do." Brielle looked at Maeve curled beneath her blanket, Mr. Whiskers held tight, her breathing steady, her face peaceful. Then she looked at Jude, the father who was afraid, and answered in a voice she wanted him to believe more than anything she had ever said in her life. "You'll come back." Night came without warning, not darkness slowly settling the way it did every other evening. This darkness crashed in, swallowing the Concincaid estate in a silence thick as melted asphalt. Jude and Vaughn left at 9 o'clock that night. 2 black SUVs slipped through the iron gates without headlights and vanished into the dark as if they had never existed at all. Jude didn't say goodbye to Dorothy or Maeve. He had already said it in his own way the night before, beside his daughter's bed, with the words, "If I don't come back." Dorothy knew. She didn't ask where her son was going. She only cooked dinner earlier than usual, held Jude 1 second longer than normal when he passed through the kitchen, then led Maeve upstairs. She sang the child to sleep with an old song, her voice low and warm, drifting through the half-open door into the hallway where Brielle sat. Brielle sat on the wooden floor with her back against the wall just beside Dorothy and Maeve's room. Across her lap lay the oak staff, 32 inches long, an inch and a half thick, the surface smooth with varnish, heavy and perfectly balanced, its center of gravity exactly 1/3 of the way from the top. Jude's gift, left outside her bedroom door yesterday morning with no note and no need for one. She knew what the staff was. It was the finished version of the rusted chair leg from the June Street. It was an unspoken sentence, telling her that he remembered what she had held when she stood between his mother and his daughter and danger, and that next time, he wanted her holding something more worthy of her hand. Brielle tightened her grip on the oak, feeling its familiar weight in the palm that had grown more calloused from 3 weeks of training with Mr. Cho. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes stayed open, alert, every sense stretched to its limit. She could hear Dorothy's lullaby softening, then fading. She could hear Maeve's breathing settle as the child drifted into sleep. She could hear the night wind moving the oak branches outside the windows. She could hear the footsteps of 4 guards making their rounds through the grounds. Steady, One circuit every 15 minutes. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, nothing. At 11:23, the first gunshot sounded, far away. At the outer gate, one shot, then two, then a short burst, dry and clipped. The sound of suppressed automatic fire like cloth ripping over and over. Then silence. Brielle stood, not quickly, not in panic. She rose in one single motion, her center of gravity low, the oak staff running along her right arm, the tip angled down. Exactly the stance Mr. Cho had taught her. The shots came again, closer now, from the front lawn. Then the sound of glass breaking on the first floor, then running footsteps, then silence. Silence more frightening than gunfire, because silence meant the security team was no longer shooting. From inside the bedroom, Maeve began to cry, her small voice trembling as she called for her grandmother. Dorothy whispered comfort, her own voice calm beyond reason, the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has lived 72 years and knows panic saves no one. "Hush, darling. Grandma's here. I'm here." Brielle listened, and every muscle in her body tightened, then loosened, steady as breath. She wasn't the girl from the June street anymore. That girl had fought on instinct, on pain, on memory, on Penny, on wildfire burning hot and uncontrolled. The woman standing in this dark hallway was different. 3 weeks with Mr. Cho had not turned her into a master, but they had turned wildfire into steel. Will does not burn. It flows, like water carving a mountain. Footsteps in the first floor hall. 2 sets. Heavy shoes. Moving fast but not together. Not Jude's team, because Jude's men moved like one body. These were mercenaries, quick but broken apart from one another. They started up the stairs. Brielle moved. She didn't run. She slid, backing into the corner of deepest shadow where the hallway turned right, where the darkness was thickest and the line of sight from the stairs didn't fully reach. She made herself smaller, the oak staff drawn close to her body, breathing slow and even, not a single sound escaping. The first man appeared at the top of the staircase, big, black clothes, mask, suppressed pistol held in both hands, the muzzle sweeping down the hall. He stepped past the turn without looking left, because the darkness there was too dense, and no one expects a threat to be standing half a step away. Brielle turned at the hips. The oak staff swept low at ankle height. Clean, fast, precise. The man lost his balance, both legs cut out from under him, his body crashing sideways. Before he even hit the floor, Brielle was above him, the oak staff raised vertical and then driven down, the rounded end slamming into his temple. A dull, heavy sound. He lay still. The second man heard the impact and rounded the corner, gun already lifting. But he turned toward the floor, where he thought the sound had come from, and Brielle wasn't on the floor. She was to his left, already moving in the split second while he turned, and the oak staff thrust straight into his throat, with the tapered end. Not the wild, desperate stab of the day she drove metal through the kidnapper's thigh on the street. This was exact, controlled, the precise point Mr. Cho had taught her, where the trachea lay exposed between the 2 sternocleidomastoid muscles. The man made a choked sound, dropped the gun, clutched at his throat with both hands, and his knees folded. He collapsed beside his partner, wheezing, eyes bulging, no longer capable of fighting. Brielle stood in the hallway. The oak staff in her hand was streaked with blood, dark red spreading across the glossy varnish, both like and unlike the rusted iron chair leg from that street long ago. Like it because it was a weapon in her hand. Unlike it because the woman holding it was no longer the woman she had been then. Her breathing remained even. Her heart didn't pound wildly. Her hands didn't tremble. From inside the bedroom, Maeve sobbed into a pillow, the sound muffled and frightened. Dorothy kept whispering the lullaby, her voice shaking only slightly, but never stopping, and Brielle stood in front of that door. Back straight, eyes scanning the dark hallway, oak staff ready in her hand, impenetrable. On the June street, she had been wildfire, burning bright but close to burning herself into ash. In this dark hallway, she was tempered steel, water that had carved a mountain. And no one, not anyone, was going to get through that door. At the same time, on the other side of the city, Reno Volkov's warehouse was no longer a fortress. It was a trap, and Reno was the last rat still alive inside it. Jude didn't attack through the front door. He didn't attack through any door at all. His team cut power to the entire area at 11:15, exactly 8 minutes before Reno's strike team breached the estate gates. Darkness fell across the industrial district like a black blanket. Then they went in. Not through the doors, through the roof, through 3 openings in the rusted metal walls that Vaughn's men had surveyed the week before. Through the drainage system beneath the concrete floor. Reno's hired guns, 20 shooters recruited from Detroit and Milwaukee, had been trained to fire weapons, not to fight in the dark against ghosts in black suits moving without a sound. The battle lasted less than 4 minutes. There was nothing cinematic about it. No dramatic exchange of gunfire. Only the repeated soft thuds of suppressed shots, the sound of bodies dropping, the clatter of metal hitting the floor, and then silence. 4 minutes. 20 gunmen. Silence. When the tactical flashlights came on, the warehouse looked like a battlefield that had already been cleaned up. Bodies lay neatly along the walls, weapons gathered away, blood soaking into the concrete. Jude's men moved through the wreckage with the cold efficiency of people who had done this so often it had become administrative routine. And in the middle of the warehouse, on the old cracked leather chair, Reno Volkov sat. The Beluga vodka bottle had shattered at his feet, liquor spreading across the concrete and mingling with the blood of his men. The rusted iron table in front of him had been overturned, maps and papers scattered across the floor. The old photograph, the one showing him beside Concincaid by the fishing boat, lay face up beneath the chair, the glass cracked. Reno didn't rise when Jude stepped into the light, not because he could not, because he chose not to. He sat there with his shoulders slack, his hands resting on his thighs, looking up at Jude with an expression Brielle would not have recognized if she had been there, because it held none of the savagery she had known only through stories. It was tired, and strangely enough, it was almost peaceful. Jude stood in front of Reno, 3 steps away, with no gun in his hand. He didn't need one. Vaughn stood 2 steps behind him, weapon loaded, barrel angled toward the floor. 6 other men formed a ring around them. Reno looked around, at the dead bodies of his men, at the ruined warehouse, then back at Jude. And he laughed. The sound was wet, warped, dragged up from a throat full of liquor and phlegm, echoing through the empty warehouse like a voice from inside a coffin. It wasn't the laugh of a madman. It was the laugh of a man who knew he had lost and yet still held one last card to play. "You're more like your father than you think, boy." Reno's voice was hoarse, every word damp with alcohol. Same way of coming in, same way of standing, same look in the eyes. Declan looked at me that way too, the night he found out I'd been skimming money the first time. But Declan spared me, because Declan understood loyalty. He tilted his head. "You don't understand loyalty. You only understand control. Don't speak about my father." Jude's voice was flat, but the tendon in his neck lifted for half a second. "Your father," Reno repeated, as if savoring the words. Concincaid. "My brother, the man who gave me everything, then let his son take it all back." He paused, laughed more quietly. Then his voice dropped almost to a whisper, a sound so soft everyone in the warehouse had to hold their breath to hear it. "Catherine." 1 word. Jude didn't react, but his lack of reaction in that moment was different from every other time he had not reacted before. It was harder, sharper, as though inside him, everything had just frozen solid all at once. "That car," Reno continued, his voice light as a feather, light in the cruelest way. "Lakeshore Drive, brake failure. Accident," the police said. He turned his wrist in a lazy motion, as though stirring liquor in a glass that no longer existed. "The brakes failed on that exact day, the exact day Catherine was going to meet someone she should not have met. Funny, isn't it? Quite a coincidence." Jude went still, for the first time. For the first time in 3 years, in 10 years, in his whole life. Not still on the outside. On the outside he remained upright, motionless, perfect. But inside, in the place where Catherine's oil portrait looked down every morning, in the place where Maeve had once asked if her mother liked butterflies, and he had forced himself to answer. In that place, a crack appeared, a crack in the mask, and Reno saw it. He laughed louder. The smile spread across his dark red face, his eyes lighting with the vicious satisfaction of a man who knew he was about to die, but still had time to drive in one final knife. "You'll never know the truth, boy. Never know who touched that car. Never know why Catherine died. Because I'm taking it down with me." The gunshot. 1 round. Clean. Dry. From behind Jude, Vaughn, the bullet hole appeared in the middle of Reno's forehead, round, black, precise. His eyes opened wider. The smile remained on his mouth. His body tipped backward, his spine striking the leather chair, his head falling back, and he sat there dead, the smile frozen on his face like a wax figure in a museum of horrors. The warehouse went silent, absolutely silent. No one moved. Vaughn lowered his gun, stepped forward once, his voice low and professional. "It's done, sir." Jude didn't turn. He stood looking at Reno's corpse, looking at the frozen smile, looking at the old cracked photograph beneath the chair. 2 men beside a fishing boat, one dead 10 years ago, the other dead 30 seconds ago. And then he said one word. Not yet. One word. But Vaughn understood. Not finished. Reno was dead, but he had taken the secret with him. Catherine, the car, the brakes failing on that exact day. The truth now lay in the mouth of the dead, and the dead don't speak. Jude Concincaid stood in the middle of a warehouse full of bodies, in absolute victory, his empire secure, his enemy eliminated. Yet inside him, in the place where Catherine's portrait looked down each morning, a new bomb had just been planted, and the clock had already begun to count. Dawn came more slowly than usual, as though the sun itself needed courage before looking down on the city after the night that had just passed. Brielle stood on the second-floor balcony of the Concincaid estate, the oak staff resting against the railing beside her, her eyes on the eastern horizon, where the first light was turning the clouds, the color of ash washed with pink. She had not slept, not because of nightmares, but because she had guarded Dorothy and Maeve's door through the entire night, sitting on the wooden floor in the hallway with her back against the wall and the oak staff across her lap, until Vaughn's reinforcement team arrived at 4 a.m. and confirmed that the estate was secure. After that, she had stepped out onto the balcony, not to sleep, but to breathe, to fill her lungs with morning air that carried no smell of gunpowder or blood. Footsteps behind her, not the footsteps of a guard, too slow, not Dorothy's, too heavy. Jude. He came to stand beside her, 1 step away, his eyes turned in the same direction. He said nothing. The 2 of them watched the sunrise in silence, the silence of 2 people who had survived a night without knowing whether the other one would survive it too. A silence that needed no filling because it was already full. Brielle studied Jude from the corner of her eye. He was still wearing the black suit from the night before, his shirt collar open, no tie. His gaze rested far away, farther than the horizon, farther than the city, fixed on some place she could not touch. His jaw was tighter than usual, if that were even possible. The tendon in his neck showed faintly. There was a new burden on his shoulders. She could see it. Something he had brought back from Reno's warehouse that wasn't victory. "You kept your word," Jude said, his eyes still on the dawn. His voice was low, rougher than usual, the voice of a man who had either spoken too much during the night or not enough. "You did too," Brielle answered. 4 words, 2 sentences, and between those 2 sentences lay the whole story of the night before, of the last 3 weeks, of the silent agreement made on a South Side sidewalk in the June light. He had promised he would return. He had returned. She had promised she would not run. She had not run. "What are the 2 of you doing out here in the cold?" Dorothy's voice drifted from the balcony door, bringing with it the smell of hot coffee and the familiar music of gentle scolding. She stepped outside with a tray and 2 coffee cups in her hands, her eyes sweeping over her son and the younger woman before she shook her head. "Up all night. Both of you. Here, take these and drink before you collapse on the balcony, and the neighbors think something is wrong in this house." She pressed 1 cup into Jude's hand and 1 into Brielle's, fussing at them the way she did every morning, as though the night had not held gunfire, blood, and 2 unconscious men sprawled on the upstairs floor before Vaughn's team had cleared them away before she woke. Dorothy knew. She always knew. But she chose normality, because normality was the thing that kept this house from falling apart. Grandma, Miss Bree, Daddy. Maeve came flying onto the balcony, her curls tangled from sleep, her bare feet light on the floor, Mr. Whiskers tucked beneath one arm, her eyes shining as though she had not been sobbing in the dark only a few hours earlier. She seized Brielle's hand and tugged hard. Come on down to the garden. There are butterflies. 3 butterflies. Miss Bree, come see." Brielle looked down at her. The little hand gripping hers was warm and certain. Maeve's eyes were round and bright, full of that light only a 5-year-old can carry, the kind of light that believes morning butterflies matter more than the darkness that came before them. Maeve dragged the whole family down to the garden. Dorothy followed, holding Jude's hand and pulling him along, while he made no protest. The four of them stood in the garden in the newborn light. A 72-year-old grandmother, a 36-year-old kingpin, a 27-year-old waitress, and a 5-year-old child pointing excitedly at a red rosebush where 3 butterflies had settled, wings opening and trembling softly in the morning sun. "Daddy, look, butterflies on the roses. Like Mommy liked. Mommy liked roses, and butterflies landed on them, so Mommy would like both. Right, Daddy?" Jude looked at the roses, at the butterflies, at his daughter, and his hand found Dorothy's hand and held it tightly. She said nothing. She only squeezed back. 2 hands, one wrinkled and one strong, clasped in the middle of a rose garden, while a 5-year-old child twirled in circles, chasing butterflies and laughing. Brielle's phone vibrated in her pocket. She took it out and opened the message. A text from Lakeshore Institute. One short line. "Miss Dawson, Penny smiled today. For the first time in 3 years. When staff played music this morning, she turned and smiled. We thought you would want to know." Brielle's hand trembled. She read the message again. Then once more. Penny smiled. Her eyes filled, warm and wet. But she didn't cry. She had already cried enough at Greenfield the week before. Cried enough for 11 years. Cried until there had been nothing left. Now she simply stood there in the garden with the morning sun on her face, hearing Maeve laugh, breathing in the scent of roses, holding a phone that told her sister had smiled, and understanding that the world wasn't always a mute and colorless gray. She looked down at the oak staff resting by her feet, the one she had carried out from the balcony. The blood from the night before had been wiped away, but the grain of the wood still held a faint dark mark near one end, the way skin keeps scars. The scar at her temple had healed too, yet the thin line still showed whenever the light struck it from the side. Scars don't disappear. They should not disappear. They are not a sentence. They are a map, recording every turn, every fall, every time a person rose again, and leading her here, to a rose garden in the morning, to an old woman holding her son's hand, to a child chasing butterflies, to a home she had not known existed 3 weeks ago. Jude stepped closer to Brielle. His own phone had just vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and his eyes darkened. Not much, only enough for her to see. The burden from Reno's warehouse, the secret about Catherine, the bomb that had begun to count down. He looked at her. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength." Brielle looked back at him, looked into his eyes, where a new darkness was coiling, looked at his hand, still holding Dorothy's, looked at Maeve crouched beside the rosebush, whispering to the butterflies as if they understood human speech. She nodded. Peace in this world was always temporary. She knew that. Jude knew it. Dorothy knew it. Even Maeve perhaps knew it. In the way 5-year-old children understand things, adults assume they do not. But for the first time, that truth didn't frighten Brielle, because she was no longer alone. She had the oak staff in her hand and the scar at her temple. She had the crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands taped to the wall of her room. She had the old woman who made pancakes every morning, and the child who believed purple butterflies could fly through the clouds. She had a sister who had smiled for the first time in 3 years. She had a fight worth fighting. She had a family worth protecting. She had a home. And so, a forgotten soul found her purpose in the heart of the storm. Not a fairy tale ending, but something more real and stronger. Proof that sometimes the deepest wounds give birth to the greatest strength, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to remain standing while fear is still there. If Brielle's story touched you, please take a second to press like and share this video with the people you love, especially those who may need to be reminded that one person really can change everything. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can stay with us for the stories still to come, because Brielle's journey has only just begun. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that reminded you of your own life? Leave a comment below. We always want to hear what is in your heart, because every word you share gives us the strength to keep telling more meaningful stories. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.